Usually, when there's nothing good to watch on Netflix, I usually read the website answeringislam.org because because their material is so hilarious that it's funny to read through their criticisms against Islam because of how laughable it is. But one of the criticisms they say is that the Prophet Muhammad plagiarized a gospel called the pseudo gospel of Matthew. And this largely, and Prophet Muhammad allegedly plagiarized the story of the Virgin Mary's birth and the Virgin Mary's upbringing and the birth of Jesus from this apocryphal gospel. Well, there's two problems with this whole the Quran copied off New Testament apocryphal material. The first problem is, well, let's go to the pseudo Matthew. The main problem here is that the pseudo Matthew gospel actually postdates Islam. In other words, it was written after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. That gospel that they say the Prophet Muhammad plagiarized off of actually was written after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So how can Prophet Muhammad plagiarize a document that was actually written after his death? Makes no sense. Um, and I'll be leaving all the references. This is actually on the Wikipedia page. I'll be leaving that in the reference box below. The second problem, and I think this is the more serious problem with this accusation that the Quran, that the author of the Quran, which they say is Muhammad, plagiarizing off New Testament Apocrypha. The second, this is the big this is the main problem with this theory, is that the critic would have to show that those stories were circulating in Arabic in Mecca and in Medina at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. That's impossible to prove because a lot of these books were actually discovered, in 1945 in the Nag Hammadi, in the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945. They discovered all these apocryphal or these Gnostic or apocryphal gospel of the proto-evangelical of James, the Gospel of James, etc. So the critics say the Prophet Muhammad plagiarized off the Gospel of James and the infancy Gospel of Thomas. When they say that the story of Jesus making the clay birds in the Quran is actually copied off the infancy Gospel of Thomas. The story of the Virgin Mary is copied off the Gospel of James, etc. 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 The problem with all those assertions is that those stories, there's no evidence that those stories were circulating in Arabic at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And the second problem is that those texts were discovered in 1945. So how can the Prophet Muhammad plagiarize material that wasn't circulating in his language in Arabic and was discovered hundreds of years after his death? This is the faulty logic of the critics. The third point I want to make is just because the Quran mentions stories found in these apocryphal gospels, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which was from the 2nd century, or the Gospel of James, which is from the 2nd century, etc. That doesn't mean that those New Testament apocryphal stories are false, and the Quran is copying false stories. The Gospel of James was actually a big influence, or it was the Gospel of James was, according to Christian scholars, was something big, was the only source Christians had about the life of the Virgin Mary, right? If you read the New Testament, the New Testament barely mentions the Virgin Mary or the history of the Virgin Mary, except for the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. So you would have to go to sources outside the Gospel of Luke to understand the history of the Virgin Mary, how she bore Jesus, or what was her story before she bore Jesus, etc. So it could be that these New Testament apocryphal Gospels preserved accurate stories of the Virgin Mary, and the Quran is confirming their authenticity, or there's some truth in these New Testament apocryphal Gospels, and the Quran is confirming their truth. That's certainly possible. And as for the infancy Gospel of Thomas, as for Jesus speaking as a baby and Jesus making clay birds, which is not found in the canonical New Testament. Well, basically, the issue here is that if you read the Gospel of John, hang on, let me just pull up that verse real quick. 1 second here. Well, basically, if you read the Gospel of John, if you read, it basically says that Jesus performed many miracles. Hang on, I just had it. It says Jesus performed many miracles, and okay, right here. So, if we read the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 25, it says that Jesus performed many miracles. So it's possible that many miracles that weren't recorded in the Gospels, in the Gospel of John. So it's possible Jesus really spoke as a baby and made a clay bird, but these stories didn't make it into the New Testament. They somehow made it into the Apocrypha, and the Quran is confirming their authenticity. These were true stories, and the Quran is confirming that they were true stories. Another thing I noticed is that the Quran is actually accurate in its description of the Virgin Mary's of Jesus' birth and the Virgin Mary's giving birth to Jesus. We see we read in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 1 to 2. There's the Christian tradition is that Jesus' birth came from the East. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 1 to 2, the Christian tradition associates Jesus' birth with the East. So, what's interesting about this, or, how this collaborates with the Quran, is that, if we read the Quran, hang on 1 second. Yeah, if we read the Quran, chapter 19, verses 16 to 18, it says, and mentioned in the book, Mary, when she retired from her family into an eastern place and took a veil to screen herself from them, and we sent unto her our spirit, and he took for her the semblance of a well-made man. She said, verily I take refuge in the merciful one from thee, if thou art pious. The Quran, chapter 19, verses 16 to 18. So basically, the Quran is basically saying that Jesus was born in an eastern place, and the Virgin Mary retired to an eastern place, and that's exactly what we read in the Gospel, in the New Testament accounts of the birth of Jesus. The Christian tradition associates Jesus' birth with the East, and this is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. So how did the author of the Quran know that Jesus' birth came from the East without reading the New Testament? Keep in mind that the New Testament wasn't translated into Arabic until the 9th century. In other words, the New Testament was in Arabic at least 300 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So I think I think the Quran is surprisingly historically accurate here, because the author of the Quran knew that Jesus was born in the East. Something that wouldn't have been known to the Arabs in Arabia. Given that the New Testament wasn't translated into their language, at least 300. There was no New Testament in Arabia. That's the first thing. And the second thing is the New Testament wasn't translated into Arabic until 300 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So this, to me, is further indication that the author of the Quran knew history and knew where the Virgin Mary knew where Jesus was born. So that's another accuracy of the Quran. So this is just my 2 cents about the whole Quran copying off New Testament Apocrypha. Stay tuned. The final videos are coming up.